in the way that people accepted the religion.
I guess I'm confused about what the question is.
Well, when we were talking about the covenant between Abraham and God, it just seemed like
My very first
kind of
it's very exciting.
irrelevant to it. They just had to go ahead and have a circumcision, and that was all they had to do with it. But it seems to me when I read it that they also had the obligation to acknowledge one God, and that was why it's a covenant, because there's two sides to it.
Yeah, so I think what Sonia is speaking to is sort of this question of the two stories that we talked about over the last 2 weeks about the ways to describe this covenant, the Jewish people's covenant with God. And we looked at the covenant of being, which all you have to do is be a part of the Jewish people. And from one way of understanding the covenant of being, it's immutable. It's a promise. God is never going to take away that promise. And it just comes from being sort of constituted like through belonging to this family, the family of the Jewish people. And no actions that you have to take, including not circumcision, right? That no actions that you have to take to be part of that covenant of being. Well, last week we also talked about the covenant of becoming, and it's a feature of the covenant of becoming that we aspire to, we strive for sort of holiness. We strive to live up to the ideals and the values, the beliefs, the commandments, the mitzvot of the Jewish tradition. And so both, right, both the story of the Jewish people as being a part of an immutable covenant with God, and the story of being in a covenant with God that is conditional on our doing the mitzvot and being a part of this mission, both of those are deeply interwoven within all of the text of the Torah. So there is one way to read it where sort of Genesis is about the covenant of being, and Exodus, with its emphasis on Sinai, is about the covenant of becoming. But that's not, and certainly, right, the authors of the Torah wanted to present the covenant of becoming as the next stage in a progression of Jewish development, right? There was the covenant of being, and that was all well and good while the Jewish people was like a family. But now the Jewish people is a nation, and we're going to have power in a land. And Deuteronomy talks about over and over and over about the land that God is giving you. Now that we're going to have power, being is not sufficient. You also have to be for some reason. You have to live up to some mission. You have to have value. But if you actually read the texts, it's not at all clear that there is that kind of natural progression. And certainly when you look at Jewish history, Jews themselves have always told both stories. So in the rabbinic period, and in the medieval period, and in the modern period, there have been Jews who don't do very much Jewish, but who see themselves as being a part of the Jewish people. So there are Jews of being in every generation. And even for Abraham, and right, Abraham is like, there was a mission involved in founding this Jewish people. And so even when you read the book of Genesis, there is sort of valence of the mission, the approach. What is the Jewish people supposed to exist to accomplish in the world. And and so the Jewish people have always had a mix of both being and becoming, and they have to be sort of intertwined, interwoven. And the story that we tell about ourselves has to be about both being and becoming. So that was one of my takeaways from the last week, and also, right, I was very engaged with one of the characters from the interview, Alana Stein-Hain, and I was really drawn into how she spoke about her sense of Judaism, especially when she said, right, I'm a Jew whose very Judaism of being, right, is grounded in aspirational covenant, in the idea of becoming, right? That is, right, what it means to be a Jew is to engage with Torah, with the text, with the textual tradition, and that textual tradition has aspirations and mitzvot. And I think that was very powerful, right? That in fact, it's because of the aspirations and the mitzvot that she finds herself re-grounded in a desire to see herself as a part of the Jewish people, of all the Jews. So I found that very motivating and meaningful, and I'm excited because tonight's lecture is Alana Stein-Hain is giving a lecture. So we're going to get to have more of it. Terrific. So does anybody else have any questions or thoughts from last week? Murray. Oh, you have to unmute.
Murray, you're muted.
Once a person has achieved all the qualifications, all the requirements and the covenant of becoming, does that then cease and that person then has a covenant of being?
I think not, right? I think the reason why it's becoming is that it's a constant process of aspiration. And I don't think anybody ever achieves all of it. I mean, the Rambam's sort of structure of these are the 13 things you have to believe, he meant that as sort of a ground floor, right? That was an entry for him, right? He really thought that, you had to believe those things just to get in the door. And then you could rise up to all the other mitzvot. That's certainly not how I think about sort of community building. And probably there's enough of the Judaism of being in my story of the Jewish people that I'm not going to throw somebody out for wrong belief, at least not for some wrong beliefs. All right, not for some wrong beliefs. All right, so I'm going to jump into today, and here's the hook for today. You probably saw in the weekly this morning that I included the Rabbinical Assembly's strongly worded response to the Amnesty UK's report that came out this week with libelous and slanderous accusations about Israel's actions, referring to them as apartheid and targeting Israel in a completely biased way. Okay. I'm already, right, I shared the United Synagogue, the RA's like strongly worded response to that. But another possible way to read that is, yet again, the international community has pointed out Israel's human rights abuses, with respect to the Palestinians. Are there human rights abuses? Assuredly, yes. So, what do we do when the Jewish state is not living up to our ideal model of what we would hope the Jewish state would live up to? What do we do when the Jewish state does not live up to the values that we hold so deeply are our aspirations as a Jewish people? And I think this sort of goes to the heart of the question at the core of this class, which is, here we are, we're the American Jewish community, and we can write strongly worded letters to the UN Secretary General, the Jewish Federations of North America are asking everybody to sign this letter to the UN Secretary General saying, you have to stop this unfair targeting of Israel. And certainly I believe that. I believe that strongly. And right, that's a right one way that you could describe that response is, the Jewish institutions are circling the wagons again and refusing to acknowledge the actual human rights abuses that Israel is doing, and they're not it's not good enough, right? Just to say you can't criticize Israel just because it's Israel. No, if Israel is doing something wrong, maybe Israel deserves to be criticized. Okay, right? That I've presented a spectrum of possible responses that a person could have. Today's class about universalism and particularism talks about the text we're going to read, and especially the extra sort, the background reading that I asked you to look at, specifically these letters to these op-eds in the Times of Israel, which we're going to look at together a little bit. The one from Dany Gores and the one from Sharon Browse, right? There is a tension between the survival of our group, right? The survival of our group, and let's not mince words, right? The Jewish people is probably, arguably, the most hated people in the world. And so there's a tension between the survival of our group and our commitments to Judaism, which we hope transcend us and have an impact toward the goodness of the whole world. And so there's this question of, okay, like, is it enough to just be Jewish? Or are we supposed to be Jewish for some reason? And is that reason only to tell the Jewish story? Or is there a way in which that reason is that the Jewish story is supposed to impact the story of the whole world? And so we're going to look at some of these texts that connect to that. But before we jump into the text, if anybody has any responses to what I've just said.
Just a point of information, yesterday's Wall Street Journal in its editorial had the strongest editorial against Amnesty International. Notice the strongest editorial one could express in criticizing and ripping it apart of any any commentary, any speaker I've ever heard, ever seen. And really, the Wall Street Journal has to be commended for that.
Murray, I'd love to see that article if you can send it to me.
Yeah, Margaret has it, she'll save it.
Okay.
And you send it all around?
Yeah, sure. If I get it, I'll be happy to send it.
Save it.
Thank
I'll do it.
Any other comments?
Stressful thing in many ways to say, well, there's a lot of things that are going on in Israel with Israel that I don't agree with, and yet you go back and forth with it. Do you just write it off and say, okay, I don't agree with it, it's not relevant to me, I'll move on with my life, that's it, or do we get engaged and involved? And there's that constant tension that's there. Who do I contribute to within Israel? In what way do I contribute? What do I support or not support? Obviously,
Right.
there are many political parties in Israel. Were I to make Aliyah and be there, what party would I join? Whatever, I may not agree with Bennett's party, but who do I agree? Whatever. It's a pluralistic thing.
Yeah.
So I'm just saying it's a constant tension there as to how relevant are they to me and us?
Yeah.
Rabbi?
Yes.
Yeah, I was struck by your statement that Jews are the most hated people in the world. I'm not sure we want to win that contest.
Oh, I am sure we do not want to win that contest.
And I wonder about the Romani and the treatment of gypsies through the centuries.
Yep. There's no
And
question. There's no
other
question that
persecution.
there are other peoples who could be who could possibly argue for this.
I'm not sure that the Jewish people are the most hated. I believe they are the greatest bias against the Jews, the greatest prejudice, but I'm not sure that there is that kind of a emotion that amounts to a hatred.
Mhm.
Yeah,
I
I
think-
think most favorite scapegoat might be a good one.
Most favorite scapegoat.
Oh,
I
that's
think
terrible.
that one of the reasons why the Jewish Federation of North America responds so vociferously to reports like this one from Amnesty International is because every time one of these reports comes out, there's an uptick in anti-Jewish, not anti-Israel, but anti-Jewish violence around the world. And it you can watch report like this comes out and there's an uptick in the number of reported incidents of anti-Jewish hatred, violent anti-Jewish hatred. And I do think that one of the reasons why people respond so vociferously is not just about protecting the right of the state of Israel to be safe and secure, but also a concern for worldwide Jewry and the safety of Jews worldwide. So one way to read that is, it's terrible when these reports come out because people blame the Jews for the actions of the Jewish state. And another way to read it is, it's terrible that the Jewish state behaves in such a way that causes anti-Jewish sentiment and hatred to rise when people actually look at what the Jewish state is doing. Now, right, I think that it is possible to describe the Amnesty International report as libelous and beyond the pale and attacking Israel above and beyond, like really targeting Israel, and also find some of the conclusions of that report to be fairly credible. right? I think you can hold both of those things. Now, I also haven't read the report. I've only read articles about it. And I have my own, right, set of biases, and I've been on the ground in Israel, and I've talked to Palestinians, and I've talked to Israeli Arab citizens, and my own personal experience shapes my sense of justice and injustice in that conflict, right? It is also possible that I haven't seen the whole truth, or that I'm got blinders on and I refuse to see the whole truth. Certainly, I have contemporaries who I have like other millennials who are more inclined to believe Amnesty International than to believe the Jewish communal institutions who are criticizing Amnesty International. And I don't know what to do with that, right? Like, what do I do with my friends who are like, yeah, I mean, Israel's guilty of all this stuff. All right, so we're going to look at some of these texts together and discuss them. And I encourage you to make lots of use of the chat to put in some to put in any comments as we go, so that we can also make sure to engage in conversation. And because I'm going to be sharing my screen, I might not see you, so just unmute and talk if you have a question. So here are the texts. So we're gonna do it a little differently today. We're gonna go through these somewhat together. So our first couple of texts speak to the creation of the world. Does somebody want to read in just in English text 1 and 2?
And God created man in his image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. You want me to read the next one too?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. For in his image did God make man. More?
Nope, that's good. Thank you. So these two texts speak to a universalism at the very, very start of our story. That is, there's nothing here about the Jewish people. Nothing here that specifies that when we say God created people in God's image, that God created Jews differently. Nope, there is a universalism very much embedded here at the very top of our people's story. Right? All people are created in the image of God. All right, let's move on to the source 3. Okay. Edith, do you want to read?
Therefore, but a single person was created in the world to teach that if any man has caused a single life to perish, he is deemed by Scripture as if he had caused a whole world to perish. And anyone who saves a single soul, he is redeemed by Scripture as if he had saved a whole world. Again, for the sake of peace among humankind, that one should not say to another, my father was greater than your father. Again, against the heretics, so that they should not say, there are many ruling powers in heaven. Again, to proclaim the greatness of the Holy Blessed One, for humans stamp many coins with one seal, and they are all like one another. But the King of Kings, the Holy Blessed One, has stamped every human with the seal of the first man, yet not one of them are like another.
Great. So the context here in the Mishnah in Sanhedrin is that this is what the court, that is the head judge, needs to say to any witness who testifies in a capital case. That is to say, right, if you're going to testify or be a judge, you're going to provide testimony or render a decision in a capital case. The community is responsible for telling you this before you testify. And so the presiding judge is supposed to say, remember that God created one human being first in order to teach that everybody comes from one human being. And if you kill someone, if you sentence someone to death, if you decide that this person is indeed, like, beyond a shadow of a doubt worthy of the death penalty, capital crime, you're cutting off a whole world. And if you save a life, you are saving a whole world. And so this aspect here, it's clearly, right, speaking to the universalism of Genesis. It's drawing on the text 1 and 2 that we saw, but right, humans stamp many coins with one seal and they are all alike, but God makes us all in the image of God. Every human being is in the image of God, but every human being is a unique individual. Every human being is different from every other human being. And so particularism, particular identity, is a feature of the universalism of creation. Mishka, I saw your hand up.
You did. I was puzzled by, if you scroll up a bit, the putting from Israel in parentheses. I don't know that I've ever seen that before. And I don't quite know what whoever did this translation meant, but to me, it talked a great deal to particularism.
Yeah, so the Mishnah as we have it, our version of the Mishnah has the word Me Yisrael in it, right? That from Israel is in our Mishnah. But the earliest manuscripts, the manuscript evidence shows that word was added later. And the reason why it was added is because of the context. Right? It wasn't added, well, it's not fair to say that. But the reason why it was added is to make the context clearer, because this was read in Jewish capital court cases, or this was supposed to be explained to people who testified in Jewish capital cases, not in general secular capital cases. This was for Jewish courts. So the addition of the from Israel, like, really sort of speaks to the this aspect of the context. But when you look at the best manuscript evidence, the word Me Yisrael isn't there, so it was added later. So the original text is much more universalist. The stuff that's in the brackets, as opposed to the parentheses, but the brackets, is added just for clarity of the English sentence. So it's not there in the Hebrew, but it's implied in the Hebrew, and so in the translation it's added for clarity. But the parentheses is both, you can see in the Hebrew and in the English, and the parentheses is reflecting a manuscript change.
That's the reference to Israel refers to the people Israel, not the land of Israel.
That's right.
Oh,
That's right. It means the Jewish people. Yisrael is sort of the rabbinic way of describing the Jews.
So it's clear if you were using this as something to be said in court, in a Jewish court, it makes sense that it's really Israel, but otherwise it seems to say, well, it doesn't matter if you kill somebody who's not
Right.
an Israelite,
That's why I found it
it's not so
disturbing.
special, who cares, It's more like,
Right, right.
yeah,
And-
it can
and
be interpreted
certainly-
that way. Yeah.
Right. Certainly that is not the intention of how it would want to
Right.
be interpreted. And it wasn't the intention of the original text.
Right.
Can you say about when this is written?
The Mishnah is codified about the year 200 of the Common Era. And the manuscripts that we have are from the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries. So it was oral for a long time before it was written down, but we know who compiled it, and we have like evidence that it was in fact a compiled set of traditions, but we don't have any manuscripts until hundreds of years after that. And then the version that most people pick up the book and read is a version that was a codex from the 16th century. And we know that 16th century codex, a book after the printing press, it favors some manuscripts, but not other manuscripts. So, and we can show the sort of the development of some of these texts over time. Yeah. All right, so in terms of like particularism and universalism, I just want to point out again that while this text is clearly sort of drawing on the universalism of Genesis, right? We were all created in the image of God. Every human being's life is worthwhile. Even killing even a single person is like killing a whole world. And what makes each person sort of worthwhile is their particularism. Like that God manages to imprint God's image on all of us in a unique and different way. So each person's individual identity like is part of what makes them like valuable and important. So it's a very powerful sort of text that speaks to that tension between universal value and universal value for particular reasons. So we've seen text 4 several times in the course of this course. First, we saw it because we wanted to talk about this sort of the Lech Lecha moment. We saw it because it's this question of the like Abraham had a covenant of becoming because he had to move, but his descendants have this like unalterable covenant that's like just that they get from being Zerah Avraham, the descendants of Abraham. But what we're looking at it here is to look at it for its statement about what it means to what is the mission of the Jewish people? What is the impact that the Jewish people is supposed to make on the world? Like, okay, so Abraham enters into a covenant with God, which Sonia mentioned right at the beginning of our class. But what is the consequence of that covenant that Abraham enters into? It's two things, right? I will bless you. So God's gonna make Abraham special, right? That's the particular vision, the particularist. Abraham is going to be set apart. Abraham is going to be a great nation. Abraham is going to have his name be great. But then the end of it, the other half of that covenant is, and you shall be a blessing. You shall be a blessing for who? What does it mean to be a blessing? It's to bless, right? The world will be blessed through you. I will bless those who bless you and curse those that curse you, and the families of the earth shall bless themselves by you. What does it mean to be a blessing? It means to have an impact on the world. It means to have a universalist mission, right? It's not just that Abraham is going to be blessed, but also that Abraham will be a blessing,
We're supposed to
And-
be a light unto the nations.
a light unto the nations, right? We are a particular people with a universalist mission. We're supposed to make an impact. All right, and Sonia also mentioned this text, the text of the circumcision, right? So again, in this context, the circumcision, right? Every male among you shall be circumcised. You shall right? Why are we doing this? Because this is a sign of the covenant between me and you and your offspring. That is to say, the circumcision is the Jewish people's lech lecha, right? We have to start by separating ourselves out, right? We have to look different. We have to separate ourselves through the act of this surgery, through the act of this ritual mark on our bodies of the covenant. And I acknowledge that this is only on some of our bodies, not on all of our bodies. But as a people, we make sure that there's a sign of the covenant cut into our flesh, and that separates us out. That makes us different. That is the particular aspect. Okay, so that's again on the side of particularism. So when we go through these texts of Abraham, we're seeing particularism and universalism. Particularism and universalism.
Can I just
Yeah.
make a comment about the different, I was in a conversation with somebody, the difference between a covenant and a contract.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very clear in this case, as there may be other covenants, this is irreversible.
Oh, so I don't think that it's true that a covenant is irreversible. So I don't think that that's
This particular one, at least as it is apparent to others, and at least what it does, it does signify a permanent relationship.
Well, I guess, right. So yes, there's a certain aspect of sort of, right. Well, we've been talking about, so the covenant of being is the covenant which is unbreakable and universal and for all time. Covenant of becoming is conditional and has, requirements that come along with it, right? Certainly there's a way in which, right, this Brit Milah is sort of like symbolic of both the covenant of being, because once you do it, it's inalterable. Right? Although aside from in Europa, you see evident, right? Like people were trying to sew their foreskins back on. I mean, that did happen throughout history, but okay, I wouldn't recommend it. That sounds very painful. But yes, right? It's both being and becoming. Yeah, I think it's right, right? And certainly the way that this is described here, it shall be a sign throughout all the generations. It's inalienable, and it's and if you fail to circumcise your foreskin, you will be having broken the covenant, etc. Right? And Ishmael, right? He's also gonna be a great nation, but he's not, part of this set aside particular thing. Yes, he was circumcised.
Oh yeah.
Okay. So now we're gonna look. So this is a particularist. You have to be set apart.
So I have a
Literally
question.
in your body. Yes, Sonia.
I have a question. Aren't Muslims circumcised?
Oh yes.
Yes.
And so what is that based on? That's not based on this covenant. That must be based on something else.
Well, no, in some sense, it is based on this covenant in respect to the fact that also Abraham and Ishmael are sacred figures in the Muslim faith, and the Quran also speaks about Abraham as an important prophet that and tells the story of Abraham and Isaac and Ishmael, and also gives this law of the circumcision. So yes, it is connected, right? But from our perspective, the Jewish people, right, Islam, right, the way that Genesis is talking is like this is one way to be set apart as the Jewish people. It, you know, there are a lot of Christians who are circumcised too. Right, we live in a, at least in the United States, at least over the last 30, 50 years, is a very circumcised population, right? Now that's swinging back more European, and right, Europe is much less of a circumcised folks, and that the trends in this country are moving more toward that as well. So I mean, it'll be interesting to see. It might feel more set apart in 20 years to get circumcised than it does now in this country. And certainly for Jews in Muslim lands throughout history, the sign of the circumcision was less of a sign relative to your neighbors and more of a sign relative to your own personal understanding, since everybody was circumcised. All right. So we're going to go to text 6. So here, God says, okay, shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do? And then, and this is sort of startling, right? Genesis 18 quotes Genesis 12, almost like, okay, you heard that Abraham is going to be a great nation, but now Genesis 18 wants you to know what that means, right? In Genesis 12, God promises, and you shall become a great nation, and all of the nations of the world are going to bless themselves by you. But Genesis 18 wants to say, oh, what did that mean? So here it quotes Genesis 12. Now the Lord had said, shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do, since Abraham is to become a great and populous nation, and all the nations of the earth are to bless themselves by him? For I have singled him out, that he may instruct his children and his posterity to keep the way of the Lord by doing what is just and right. Right? So what does it mean to be a great nation? Is to keep the way of the Lord by doing what is just and right. And what does Abraham do in this text? Right? Abraham judges whether God has done justice, whether God is acting in a just and rightful way. Right? Abraham holds God accountable to the standard of justice. Right? God is going to destroy the innocent along with the wicked, and Abraham says that is not just. Hashofet kol haaretz lo yaseh mishpat, shall not the judge of all the earth act justly? And of course, what we're saying here, right? Genesis 18 is making it very clear that what Genesis 12 means is that you're singled out for a universalist mission. You have to do justice in the world. That's what it means to be part of this Jewish people, part of the Jewish mission. You have to act justly. Okay, so one last text. Oh yeah, yep, boss.
But here, I don't think he can reach Jewish people by itself, right? This is the message to all humankind, because here it is still Abraham, the father of Islam, Judaism, Christianity.
I don't think that's certainly not how, I don't think that's how Judaism, right? So it is true that many Christians and Muslims in the late 20th century and the early 21st century, like, talk about the 3 Abrahamic traditions and as a way of sort of connecting us all. Oh, isn't it great? We all are from Abraham. And I'm not knocking that, because I think that it's very good to see us commonalities between us. To me, like interfaith dialogue is particularly good when we don't just focus on what makes us similar. Like this is the we all eat hummus form of a peace talk. No, like what makes us different and unique is also really, really important. Like,
but here, like here, it very much says like you are a gigantic nation, right?
when Genesis,
The world,
when-
it's just 12 million people.
when Genesis talks about Abraham, he really means the father of the Jewish people. It's the covenant that's passed down Abraham, Isaac to Jacob's children. It's true that Abraham is also known as Av Hamon Goyim, that like that other nations are also trace themselves back to Abraham. No question. But when it says, right, that Abraham is to become a great nation, I think the way that Genesis wants to be read is it's the Jewish people. Abraham is the first Jew. Abraham is the first Jew. So when you read Genesis, there is a covenant with the entire world, and it's a covenant that's made with Noah, right? God destroys the world by flood, and then God promises to Noah never to do it again. And there are blessings given to Adam, and challenges given to Adam, both like before and after leaving Eden. And those, right, the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis are the universalist section. But once we get to Abraham and his specific mission, it's really, I think Genesis really thinks that this is like Abraham as the first Jew. I don't think that Genesis has a conception of, oh yes, this is also Christians, also Muslims. And I think it's really the Jewish people. The mission of the Jewish people is to do this aspect of lasot tzedakah mishpat, to do what is just and right.
So how do you deal with the part of the covenant that says that your children will be as the sand of the sea, and well, there's only 40 million of us?
Yeah, right. I mean, I hear what you're saying. Like, if you include the Christians and the Muslims in that, then it does feel like there's way more people than God's promise to Abraham was more accurate. And on the other hand, like 14 million's, I mean, a very populous nation by the standards of the time that Abraham was living in. Where like if you had 150 people in your town, that was a lot. Yeah, no, it's a good point. All right, so Isaiah says, Atem edai, you are my witnesses. So what are we to do in the world? This is, Isaiah gives us another conception of what our mission is as the Jewish people. It's to witness. And this is like, we are chosen to witness, chosen for a mission, a particular mission with a universalist aim. All right, I'd like to pause here and see whether anybody has any thoughts. And then next thing I'd like to do is a short discussion of these op-eds, which I hope some people had a chance to look at. But before we get to that, if anybody has any thoughts or reactions to these texts.
Good.
What? What are we doing?
All right. Well, feel free to jump in if you do. Okay, so Daniel Gores wrote an article in 2012. It was in the context of one of these periodic altercations in Gaza between the IDF and Hamas. And Gordis is extremely upset about what he understood to be sort of both sidesism. Now, right, in our sort of modern contemporary period, this like the epitome of both sidesism was when the United States President Donald Trump looked at the march in Charlottesville and said there are good people on both sides, and wasn't able to fundamentally see a difference between these and these, right? Another more contemporary example is to say that the January 6th insurrection against the Capitol is equivalent to the previous summer's protests about for Black Lives Matter, right? So, yep, they're right to say, okay, these and these are completely equivalent is a both sidesism that doesn't lead to a clear differentiation between the aspects of each side that make them different. So Daniel Gores is afraid of sort of the balance of both sidesism, and he thinks that his colleague, my colleague Sharon Brous, wrote an article which did this both sidesism in a way that he felt was a betrayal of Jewish identity. And he blames Sharon Brous's universalism. So he says, an utterly universalized Judaism is almost entirely divorced from the richness of Jewish heritage and the worldview of our classic texts. That's bad enough. But on weeks like this, with hundreds of thousands of Israelis sleeping in bomb shelters, many millions more unspeakably frightened, it's becoming clear that this universalized Judaism has rendered not only platitudinous Jews, but something worse. It bequeaths us a new Jew utterly incapable of feeling loyalty. The need for balance is so pervasive that even an expression of gut level love for Israelis is more than for their enemies is impossible. Balance has now bequeathed betrayal, right? And then he specifically attacks Sharon Brous. And here's what Sharon Brous said that he really doesn't like. She wrote, I believe that the Israeli people, who have for years endured a barrage of rocket attacks targeting civilians and designed to create terror, instability, and havoc, have the right and the obligation to defend themselves. I also believe that the Palestinian people, both in Gaza and the West Bank, have suffered terribly and deserve to live full and dignified lives. Well, I think Daniel Gores does not disagree with the statement that the Palestinian people have suffered terribly and deserve to live full and dignified lives. He's frustrated that she felt like she had to write a sentence that started, I also believe. Like, why isn't it enough to just say the Israeli people have endured a barrage of rockets and that's all, period, full stop, end of sentence, right? That's what he's mad about. Sharon Brous wrote, we are deeply entrenched in our narratives of good and evil, victim and perpetrator, and we are scared. Over 1 million Israelis who sleep in bomb shelters, blah, blah, blah. That it's not the Jewish way to dig in our heels and diminish the loss on the other side. However you feel about the wisdom and timing of Israel's response to the Hamas threat, the people of Israel need our strong support. At the same time, supporting Israel's right to protect and defend itself does not diminish the reality that the Palestinian people are also created in the image of God, whose suffering is real and undeniable, right? So he says, on the surface, it's a lovely and innocuous message, but it's deeply troubling because it's got all this absolute balance. Anytime you have a expression of sympathy for Israelis, you immediately have a similar sentiment about Palestinians. Right? Israelis have a right to an obligation to defend themselves. Palestinians have a right to lives of dignity. Israelis are scared, but so are Palestinians. The people of Israel need our strong support and solidarity. Supporting Israel's right to protect and defend itself does not diminish the reality that Palestinian people are also the children of God. Right? So he says, of course, Israel's far from perfect. And yeah, life in Gaza is miserable, but why can't we just say that the reason why Israel and Hamas are at war is because Hamas wants to destroy Israel? Why can't we just say Hamas doesn't want to return to 1967, to pre-1967 borders? Hamas wants Israel wiped off the map. Hamas wants the Zionist entity utterly eradicated. That's what Hamas says. Why wouldn't we believe that? Why do we have to say, oh, they couldn't possibly mean that? Right? No, we're all entrenched in our narratives of good and evil, he says. That leaves no space for saying, they're evil. Right? Okay, so he's really angry at Sharon Brous. And he, instead of privately messaging Sharon Brous that he was hurt, he decided to write this, attack on her in the Times of Israel. So Sharon responded, okay, Rabbi Brous. Rabbi Dany Gores brought the discourse on Israel to a new low this week. All right, Gores, a former teacher and friend, blah, blah, blah. She likes him. Now he's offended her. Right, here's what I did not say. I did not challenge Israel's right to respond to the Hamas rockets. On the contrary, I said that Israel not only had a right, but an obligation to defend its people. Nor did I suggest a moral equivalency between Hamas and Israeli soldiers. My act of betrayal, the fairly unremarkable call to those who care deeply about Israel and bear witness to the fighting from across the ocean to remember as battle intensifies that war is never to be celebrated and that loss of all human life is tragic. Right? Gores sets her up as a strong woman, she says, right? Such Judaism, he claims, is utterly universalized, almost entirely divorced from the richness of Jewish heritage and the worldview of our classic texts. She's very upset because Gores knows that she's deeply textual, which is true. Gores believes that the empathy for Palestinian victims of war is an act of disloyalty. He comes to this conclusion based on two sloppy assumptions. First, he reads my call for empathy as an insistence that we love our enemies as much as we love our own children. That's not something that she said. Second, Gores assumes that in asking American Jews to resist gloating and instead witness with humility and compassion, I am necessarily indicating that one position is no more righteous than the other. That is also not true. Grieving for your enemies' babies does not call into question the legitimacy of your mission, your love of your people, or your loyalty to the Jewish state. It simply means that you are a human being. And then she goes on to say, by the way, the IDF says this same thing, right? Which is Israeli generals work with ethicists and Talmudists to determine how to minimize civilian casualties in every military action. There are no other armies in the world that do that, but the IDF does do that. And so she's saying, I didn't say anything that the IDF doesn't have as its own mission statement. So this expresses the real life tension between universal Jewish values and particular Jewish identity and loyalty. And I think what we're going to see in the lecture, which I think is a really good one, is sort of this question about how do we integrate both of these? How do we synthesize both an approach that is universal and particular? And our lecture is going to give us a few different paradigms for how to approach that synthesis. So Before we jump in, I just wanted to know whether anybody else had any feelings about this debate between Gordis and Brous.
Just a point of information, Daniel Gores is known to be more on the right side of the spectrum politically, quite a bit to the right. And so his commentary reflects his philosophy.
No question.
I didn't know that, but I guessed it.
And
No
he's in Israel?
I
He
have to,
lives, yeah, he lives in Israel. He's an American citizen who made Aliyah, and at the time that he was writing in 2012, his kids were in the army.
And the ladies in America?
Shannon Brous, yeah, she's the rabbi of Ikar in Los Angeles. She was in 2012, and she still is today.
And I think her
Gordis,
politics are fairly left, aren't they?
Yeah, I mean, yes, I think
Both people have views on this issue that reflect their broader viewpoints, I think.
yeah, I think her politics tend to be fairly progressive, but I would say on Israel, like nothing that I saw in that article, like the original one that Gordis was upset about, screamed left wing to me. It was like a fairly centrist American Jewish position, I think. Like, I think most American Jews would have agreed with most of what she wrote.
Gordis is a brilliant speaker. Given the opportunity to hear him, I recommend it.
He is. He's a great speaker. Little bit. He has a little bit of an ego, but he's sort of a lot of great speakers do. Yeah, Bob.
I just a comment, maybe not on the issues raised, which are very important and well covered, but I found it very painful to read this because it expresses that they were friends and now they're not friends.
yeah.
And that kind of hurt. That seems to be a lot of pain there that's present. I would wonder, that was now 9 years later or thereabouts, have they reconciled in any way? And what's the
doubt it.
story there? Yeah,
They were
I don't
friends
know.
and they
they she
were friends and
babysat for
had-
his kids, and he was her teacher,
his vitriol at her publicly.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
if they had an argument, that's one thing. If they
Right.
talked to one another and wrote
Yeah,
to one another.
I don't think that
it was ugly.
I don't think that they have made up. I was actually at a bris earlier this week, and Gordis was at it, so that was pretty funny. I mean, that's one of these things that can happen on Zoom.
Right.
Yeah. I was like, it's funny that you're here because we're going to talk about you extensively on Thursday night.
Well, reading his writings, it seems that he is moving more and more to the right. And I don't know much about the rabbi in Los Angeles, but we know Los Angeles, generally there is a progressive attitude, very prevalent. And so I can see where there have irreconcilable differences.
I just read that the mayor is a member of her congregation.
Bill Garcetti, yeah.
I had no idea he was Jewish until I saw that. Surprising.
Yeah, I was at a bar mitzvah, my grandniece's bat mitzvah at her synagogue on the morning of the Pittsburgh massacre. And she was and we had not heard it until she spoke about it. And it was she was brilliant. Just brilliant.
Yeah, she's a really, really brilliant speaker. So both of them. I mean, she is a really, truly powerful president.
Can I say something about the debate that they're, some larger issues? It seems to me that it is a tenet of progressivism to say that we can't stop war unless we begin to listen to the other side and have compassion and, exhibit higher morale, take the higher moral ground. So he's rejecting he's being a hawk. you know,
Yeah.
he wants to keep fighting.
Well, see, I think,
Or he's being a realist.
right.
That's the
I
other-
think that, like, as we talked about with Tal Becker at the very, in the first lecture, right, where we sit in America, where we're relatively safe, and where they sit in Israel, where they're relatively under constant siege, does affect how you think about these things. I want to ask us to seriously consider the ways in which universalism, it would be very easy to say, oh, American Jews are too universalist for their own good. Israeli Jews are too particularist for their own good. I want to sort of reject that and say, right, in what ways are universalism and particularism useful categories for thinking about what our mission is as a Jewish people? And right, where I started this whole class for tonight, which is sort of thinking about, right, this week, this Amnesty International thing, right? When you approach that, are you approaching it first with a particularist lens or first with a universalist lens? What emotional response do you have, and from what part of your Jewish identity is being activated by it, right? Certainly the approach that I took, which I put in the weekly this morning, right, was very much motivated by a particularist lens. And I don't take it back. I'm very glad that I put it there, right? I think it's very important to say this is libelous and doesn't have the record truly right. I think it's important to say that. But I could also have written, guys, like, this report came out and there are some parts of it that reflect a real lived problem that we have, that there are actions that Israel is taking that are not as moral or ethical or fitting our hope for what the Jewish state would do. And that would be, I think, more responding to it with a more universalist lens. And I think that I think it's important to sort of think about what is resonating for you in your Jewish response, in your Jewish identity, with regard to when these things come up. Yeah, Gary.
I just want to, one of the reactions that I have to this kind of debate that we saw in the readings is that, in the first place, both sides sound very persuasive whenever I'm reading them, and I can easily believe either one. But the end result produces this kind of paralysis that doesn't seem to move things forward. And so that part of it bothers me too. I also wanted to add, along with the your quoting at Trump at Charlottesville, and I forgot who it was, and people with regard to the January 6th. I was going to add one more and see if you think it fell in the same category. I think that Abraham Lincoln at the end of the Civil War said his finish for the Civil War was with malice toward none and charity toward all. And at least some people feel that attitude is what led to the inability of the South to come to grips with slavery and led to Jim Crow and so on.
Yeah, I never really thought about that. Right, that Abraham Lincoln was also sort of, in some ways, at least in that speech, sort of unable to say, no, this was wrong and evil, and we were fighting to free slaves, and slavery as an institution is wrong, right? In fact, even the way that we continue to teach that war as being primarily about states' rights. Yeah, it's an interesting point. Deborah. Oh, you unmuted, so I thought maybe you had something to say.
I might have, but I forgot.
All right.
It's before.
All right, well, let's jump into
What
this.
I want to say, can I say something?
Yep, for sure.
Okay, in that report, they included the Israeli Arabs with the Palestinians, and I don't see how the Israeli Arabs are living under apartheid.
Yeah.
Well, that may not very
Yeah, I mean,
They even have a representative in the Knesset, and they are
not
allowed
just
to
in the
vote.
Knesset, they're in the government. This is
In
the
the
first
government,
government
right.
of the state of Israel that includes Arab Israeli parties. Yeah, that wasn't in the amnesty report.
I thought
Yeah.
it was. I thought it was.
No, it wasn't in the amnesty report
Oh, no,
that there are Arabs in the government. I don't think it mentioned that.
no, that wasn't. But that the Arabs in Israel live under apartheid. That's what that part was.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
I do remember. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No,
Rabbi.
go ahead, Deborah.
That Federation sent out an email today with a letter to the UN that you all should have gotten. And if not, I'm happy to forward. Let me know that if we're trying to let the UN know that we are not pleased with the report and that there's a lot of things that are unfair. So the more the people that respond to it, please do. It's easy. That's all.
I did mention that at the beginning. Yes. All right, let's jump into the lecture. I hope we'll have some time. Going to see if I can play the lecture a little bit at a faster speed. Oh, please do just chat me if it's bad and I'll go back to normal. Okay. I always listen to things myself at 2x speed, and listening to it at 1x speed is like so slow. But I'm also happy okay, let's do. All right, it's 110, 1.1.
In this session, my colleague, Dr. Ilana Stein-Hain, will explore the concept of Jewish peoplehood as an idea built on containing the duality of universalism and particularism. Jews are often distinguished as either particularists or universalists, those whose Judaism is centered around a commitment to ritual and halakha, and those for whom the essence of their Judaism is tikkun olam. The purpose of this lecture is to understand Jewish peoplehood. One needs to embrace the notion that each category is in need of the other, and that Jewish peoplehood could only be understood when the two remain in constant conversation with each other. She will then explore these issues in greater depth in an interview with our colleagues, author and journalist Yossi Klein Halevi and Dr. Malila Helder.
One of the idiosyncratic features of Jewish peoplehood that complicates how we think about Zionism and the Israel diaspora divide is the classic tension between our people's commitment to the particular and to the universal. The Jewish people, as we have seen, tells a story about itself as a family that evolves into tribes and becomes a nation. As a result, a big piece of our collective identity involves narrating that particular story, putting resources towards the survival of our particular group, and policing the boundaries around this particular people. At the same time, as we've also seen, a unique characteristic of Jewish peoplehood is how our tradition pushes us to think beyond the boundaries of our particular story and of our particular community, and to imagine that the vision for the Jewish people is to achieve something that transcends us, that our commitments are supposed to have an impact on the whole world, on everyone, a universal vision for humanity. In our tradition, as we will explore, these two impulses are in tension with each other. And we have struggled for a long time to make sense of these two impulses and their consequences for our priorities and for our character. But this tradition has always navigated these tensions in relationship to different political and social realities over time and space, and never in a vacuum. How open the society is can shape the way that Jews dream about having an impact beyond our own immediate needs. How threatened we are can shift our emphasis towards ourselves. Today, we will explore the relationship between these two commitments, between Jewish particularism and Jewish universalism in our tradition and leading up to today. We will look at the ways that the dance between these ideas has characterized the development of modern Zionism. And we will trace this debate into the tensions today around Jewish peoplehood. Ultimately, I hope that we consider these forces of universalism and particularism to be more powerful as a tool to strengthen Jewish peoplehood than as they currently function, as a caricature of diverging Jewish viewpoints and weakening the ties of Jewish peoplehood. From our earliest sources, we see that the commitments to the particular and the universal are constantly intertwined. This goes back to the creation of the world, with all human beings created in the same image of God. The rabbinic commentary on this verse, as you saw, makes the theological universalism of the Bible even more radical. When God creates all human beings in the image of God, they still maintain their differences. An earthly sovereign can only stamp their coins to look identical, but God's stamp produces infinitely different humans. God's sovereignty can be universal while maintaining the independent dignity of the particular for all of God's creations. Then the promises to Abraham about the proliferation of his family are tied to the ideas that the nation which will ensue from him will not only be blessed by God, but that it will be a blessing, ostensibly to others. And then that the families of the earth will be blessed by him, that their destiny is tied to his. We then learn that the reason for his having been chosen is connected to a special role he is meant to play in pursuing justice and righteousness on behalf of the whole world, and not just on behalf of his own family. The juxtaposition of the stories of the election of Abraham in Genesis 12, the particular covenant of circumcision for Abraham and his family, which separates them from others in Genesis 17, Abraham's advocating for the people of Sodom as a test of the universality of God's and Abraham's commitments in Genesis 18, and finally, the act of obedience to God's will in the binding of Isaac in Genesis 22, taken together, paint a picture of responsibility to family, to God, and to the legacy of universal justice, all tied up together as part of the same covenantal narrative. The Bible develops this correlation further after the narrative shifts from the family of Abraham to the people of Israel, signaling that this is a collective and national commitment and is meant to be characteristic of the Jewish people as a nation. In the book of Deuteronomy, Devarim, God maintains a special relationship with the Israelites, and the Israelites have a special relationship to their land. But God also reminds the Israelites that God is the owner of all of the heavens and the earth, lest the Israelites come to the mistaken conclusion that a special status vis-a-vis God is the same as an exclusive status. Behold, the heaven and the heaven of heavens, the earth, with all that is therein, belong to the Lord your God. Hein l'Adonai Elohecha, hashamayim u'shmei hashamayim, haaretz v'chol asher ba. Moreover, the book of Deuteronomy insists that the Israelites' responsibility to build a society comes with profound obligations to the people hanging around the Israelites, who are not even part of their group. The Bible's insistence that we care for the strangers in our midst is a recurring reminder that being fixated on our particularism can make us morally blind to a wide set of obligations that transcend taking care of our own. This becomes especially important when the Israelites are established in their homeland. Once they have a sense of security about the fulfillment of their particular destiny, the Bible wants to ensure that they remain committed to larger, universal, moral goals. As the prophet says, "You are my witnesses," says the Lord, "and my servant whom I have chosen, that you may know and believe me and understand that I am the Lord." Our job is to serve as witnesses for the whole world, to God's sovereignty over it in its entirety, not only over our particular group and story. These tensions get amplified further in the prophets, especially when it becomes clear that the Israelites are failing at both missions. They are not building a civilization that is faithful religiously to their special particular mission, and they are certainly not building a model civilization that is meant to inspire all of civilization. The frustration felt and articulated by the prophets, Isaiah and Jonah especially, amplifies the sense that the Jewish people's failure to keep the covenant suffers on both fronts. Disobedience means betrayal of our own story and jeopardizes our safety and security in the Holy Land, and inclines God to leave the temple, which is located in our midst, and allow it to be destroyed. And it also entails our failure to build the kind of civilization that will restore the world to the primordial universalistic vision of the Garden of Eden, when all human beings will know and appreciate God's sovereignty and majesty through the instruments created for this purpose by the Jewish people. Now, even as we read the prophets, most Jewish readers would agree that our sources do not fully support the idea of total and radical universalism, which would come with the tearing down of all boundaries between people and create complete human equality before God, basically eliminating the special status of the Jewish people. Most of the prophetic visions for the end of days involve affirmation of the special status of Israel, not the elimination of it. Jewish ideas of universalism are not completely egalitarian, nor do they imagine homogeneity. As the prophets depict the story, the nations of the earth retain their ethnic and national imprints and remain in their lands, but they become faithful and loyal to the one God. Ultimately, the last lingering particularism is God's great oneness over all the nations of the earth. But then we'd have to say the same thing about particularism. There are voices in our tradition that advocate for extreme particularism, including the enduring superiority of the Jewish people over all others. But even those sources imagine some way in which, in the end of days, the gap closes between the destiny of the Jewish people and the other nations of the world. In other words, the idea of a total self-interest, a total moral chauvinism, is present, but constitutes a minority voice in our tradition. Let's assume then, for the purposes of our discussion, that attempts to discard either one of these commitments, to be a radical particularist or to be a radical universalist, are hard commitments to sustain relative to our sources. And both produce a kind of politics that are difficult to integrate into a broad sense of Jewish peoplehood. There are other religions and nationalisms that insist on these rigid poles, but our tradition has tended to dance with both. And at the same time, it is often the radical particularists and the radical universalists who take up the most energy in our communal debates. This is counterproductive to a real conversation on the stakes involved in navigating a serious tension in our tradition. And we are better off engaging less on either of these ends. We should also be skeptical when serious people trying to hold this tension are reduced to caricatures of extreme positions. Instead, I want us to consider what a real engagement with the tension between universalism and particularism looks like, to carry these tensions into the circumstances and politics of the present, and to explore the consequences of this dichotomy for our community's politics and our discourse. In that spirit, I want to offer three paradigms. Let's call the first approach the balance approach. The balance approach treats particularism and universalism as essentially at odds with each other and seeks a kind of Aristotelian golden mean between them, without tying the two intrinsically to one another. This is most easily understandable in reference to resource allocation, for instance. A person seeking balance would allocate some of their resources to their own community and some to the larger world, and try to hold on to these commitments as dual, mostly non-competing, but not necessarily integrated. This approach can lead to some interesting conversation about communal priorities, but it also reduces the amount to which these commitments truly claim us. The universal and the particular are massive spheres of obligation, and they have the potential to represent a major approach to the fulfillment of our visions for ourselves and the world. Merely balancing between them pretends that there's some ideal middle ground, which may actually be weak on both ends. It is true, some contemporary Jews need a little more of a push toward the particular, and some need a little more of a push toward the universal. But this approach also inclines us to believe that certain communities of Jews are inherently more universalistic and some inherently more particularistic. And I think we should be skeptical of such easy caricatures. A second approach would be a contingent or conditional approach. The conditional approach acknowledges Judaism's broader universal aims, but sees that the only way to be able to engage those aims is through first creating a strong enough foundation in the particular. The conditionalist would argue that a group or nation cannot do anything for others before it takes care of itself, and therefore would want the group to prioritize its own development and its own integrity as a precondition to larger universal aims. Many, if not most, Zionists locate themselves in this camp. They would argue that Israel's political and existential security needs precede the question of evaluating the morality of Israel's actions as it relates to the family of nations, or through their ramifications for other peoples. This does not mean that such universalistic considerations are irrelevant, but that they have to be secondary. This line of reasoning anchors itself on the idea of spheres of belonging. Only once I care for my own can I expand beyond my immediate concerns to regard for others. The concern for the universal can be delayed, maybe even to another period of time when the problems of the present have been fully addressed. In religious terms, this is sometimes expressed as messianism, which is the concern for redemption of the world, but only as a result of the messianic fulfillment of the Jewish people's story. And a third approach, perhaps the hardest to turn into a concrete political program, is a synthetic approach, which sees the successes of a particularistic agenda and a universalist agenda as entirely intertwined with one another, and evaluates the success and failure of each on the basis of the other. To such a person, a commitment to the Jewish people that does not think about larger universal consequences of that commitment is morally insufficient. To be morally serious, such a person would not insist that we would need to be suicidal, to abandon even the basic needs of survival or sustainability of the particular in service of the larger goal. But that particular commitment would need to constitute the bare minimum in order to demonstrate that the two are instrumental for the same broader goals. The philosopher Martha Nussbaum is squarely in this camp. Nussbaum allows that certain contingencies of particular identity are substantial in defining who we are, but argues that we should be committed to a kind of moral universalism that makes us push past our instinctive advocacy for our own group. Nussbaum believes that the conditions of modern life make us capable of a morality that thinks universally, and that commitments such as patriotism and nationalism can be used to obscure our moral imagination by insisting on too much loyalty to one's own group, much more than the group needs for basic survival. In our context, a synthesist in this school of thought might argue that the state of Israel, as the national expression of the Jewish people, should aspire to universal moral aims, and without having to sacrifice itself on this altar, would have to use those universal moral aims as the means of evaluating its own legitimacy. Early Zionist thinkers passionately debated the question of Zionism's goals, often hinging on this very tension. Pinsker, for instance, had lost patience for the idea that the Jewish people had to merit its right to nationalism based on a commitment to universalism. His idea of auto-emancipation was essentially a form of radical particularism, investing in the Jewish people and its national aspirations for its own sake. Herzl seems to have picked up on aspects of Pinsker. He too was frustrated that the Jewish people could seemingly never be integrated into the family of nations, despite how hard they tried. But he also retained some measure of a commitment to the universal. At the end of his book, The Jewish State, he presents as a conditionalist. Once we establish a foothold for ourselves and for our families, what we build in Israel will redound with goodness for the world. But perhaps the best example for us to look at in evaluating the legacy of the universal and the particular in modern Zionism is Zev Jabotinsky. A clear and unabashed nationalist, Jabotinsky also believed in liberalism, and in particular, in the urgency of a Jewish nation state treating its Arab citizens in a way that affirmed democratic values and didn't undermine them. Jabotinsky wrote extensively about universal equality, citing in his writings the idea that the human being is created in the image of God. He also made clear to differentiate between the rule by the majority as democracy, when it takes seriously the treatment of its minorities, and tyranny, when it fails to do so. Jabotinsky lived prior to the creation of the state, and his ideas represent a clear effort to integrate, perhaps to balance, perhaps to condition, perhaps to synthesize, between his particular aims for the Jewish people to sovereignty and statehood, and his universal beliefs of human equality to the best that can be achieved in a framework of Jewish sovereignty. I think it is fair for us to now wonder, what would Jabotinsky, or Echad Ha'am, or Buber, or Arendt, or many of the other pre-state thinkers make of the modern-day question of the Jewish state and its priorities in our existing calculus of the relationship between our commitments to ourselves and our own well-being and our commitment to a moral universality which transcends what is good just for the Jews? And in a similar vein, we might ask about the contentious conversation in our community about Zionism and loyalty to the Jewish people. Is it sufficient to be loyal to the Jewish people and to the state of Israel, regardless of what the state of Israel does? Is it acceptable to be loyal to the state of Israel based on what we might consider to be its loftier and more universal goals, and to be disappointed when it falls short? In 2012, the Times of Israel hosted a difficult and contentious version of this discussion on its pages. Rabbi Dany Gores, living in Israel, publicly criticized Rabbi Sharon Brous, living in Los Angeles, for what he perceived as an affront precisely in terms of our discussion. He claimed that Rabbi Brous, in offering a prayer for the victims on both sides of the war in Gaza, skewed towards universalism over particularism, in taking a publicly critical, or at least publicly concerned stance about Israeli military actions. In essence, he argued, loyalty to the Jewish people entails support for one's own community, a commitment to the particular before anything else. Rabbi Brous, in her response, denied the charges and cited in her defense that since it was already the policy of the Israel Defense Forces to try to minimize Palestinian casualties, then the prayer that they do so was not a commitment to the universal over the particular, it was an affirmation of the policy of the State of Israel itself. Rabbi Ed Feinstein helped close the chasm between the two arguments, even if he didn't succeed to heal the rift between the two writers. Citing the story of Abraham and the promise to Abraham that intertwined the particular with the universal, Rabbi Feinstein argued, as a synthesist, that Gordes's fixation on the particular needed Brous's concern for the universal just as much as the other way around. Feinstein also signaled something very important. It is easy to caricature either position as pure particularism or pure universalism. This happens all the time with the way people paint those on the left or those on the right with one concern over the other, or painting American Jews and Israeli Jews as holding to one or to the other pole disproportionately. Feinstein showed how both rabbis were dancing between the poles, expressing some measure of conditionality or synthesis in their effort to take seriously both the physical safety of the Jewish people and its moral character. The conversation and Feinstein's intervention reminded me of the approach of Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook in considering what it means for Jews to work together when coming with commitments that are in tension with one another. His argument was that factions within the Jewish people that disagree, specifically regarding the tension between the particular and the universal, need each other. They need each other not for simply the sake of getting along or for self-protection. They need each other because in their interaction, seeing each other's principles and moral concerns will keep them from their own fundamentalisms, from becoming indeed the most extreme and the most caricatured versions of themselves in reality. Only through interaction and a sense that their approaches should actually condition each other can they keep each other dancing within this tension. The various conditions which modernity has afforded the Jews have produced whiplash-like consequences on the question of the universal and the particular. Some European Jews in the 19th century, upon experiencing the beginnings of emancipation, evolved into radical universalists, seeking to shed the baggage of particularism and hoping to construct a universal moral and political community unencumbered by a particular ideology. In the 20th century, after the Holocaust, many conservative thinkers repudiated the failure of universalism and mocked its allure, declaring that Jewish particularism was what remained when Jews finally awoke to see that universalism was a failure. Zionism, over the last century and a half, has contained all these multitudes and more. Every possible permutation of the commitment to the particular and the commitment to the universal. And with the creation of a Jewish state on the world stage, a Jewish state in the family of nations, a Jewish state that has achieved almost messianic accomplishments, has pushed the referendum on universalism and or particularism to the forefront of the Jewish consciousness. And in North America, the simultaneous eruption of the agendas of social justice, tikkun olam, Jewish renewal, and various forms of both Jewish insularity and Jewish boundary crossing as frenetic responses to the open conditions in which North American Jews find themselves are producing new permutations in the dance between these values. There is no neat way to argue on how our people can resolve this tension. Perhaps its reappearance and renegotiation throughout our history reminds us that it is not meant to be resolved, but it might serve as a great arena for the Jewish people to debate our rights and responsibilities in the world and to one another. Thank you.
Thoughts, reactions? I know it was a lot. Not only did she talk about universalism and particularism, but then she also applied it to 3 paradigms for engaging that tension, balance, condition, integration or synthesized. And then she also applied it to early Zionism. And then she also talked about the modern debate about Israel. She did a lot there in those 26 minutes.
5 lectures.
Yeah.
But very good. Very articulate.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, she's.
I thought she distilled the arguments made in the various writing very easy, much more easy to understand and really not have to deal with a lot of verbiage around what Gordis especially is very verbose, at least from what his writings indicate. And I think she did a pretty good job of digesting that. And Browse, is that how you pronounce Sharon Browse's arguments as well?
Yeah.
And I like that you made her talk fast. That was good. More
I couldn't
interesting.
shake the feeling that you'd had too much coffee to drink.
Yeah, but it made
I
it more
know.
interesting to listen to.
Yeah, I pretty much exclusively listen to audio at 2x or 3x speed.
You know, you could do that.
But yeah, you can train yourself to be able to understand things quicker and quicker. So like if you like podcasts, it's a complete aside and not relevant to the class. But if you like podcasts and you usually listen to them at 1x speed, like this coming week, listen to them at 1.3 speed, and then the following week at 1.7 speed, and you can actually train your ear to pick it up faster. I'll also say, like, I find it easier to do with headphones than just with speakers. Like if my ears are picking up ambient noise also, I find it much harder to listen at fast speed.
That makes sense.
So like on my car, it doesn't work as well. Anyway, okay. Completely irrelevant, just my own personal approach. Yeah, so I think
Now we have to hear something else.
For me, thinking about engaging in this tension between universalism and particularism, thinking through like the balanced approach where, okay, some resources go to our community and some resources go to the broader, I'm going to give some of my tzedakah money to Jewish institutions, and I'm going to give some of my tzedakah money to universalist institutions, right? I think a lot of us do that.
Yeah.
To think about sort of, okay, I'm only going to give to universalist groups when I feel like the needs of my community are met, right? Which would be the sort of conditional approach, kind of a messianic approach. When the Jewish community is fully realized, then the Jewish community will be a light unto the nations. But until then, nobody else is investing in the Jewish community, so I'm going to invest my resources in the Jewish community, right? That's our primary approach. Not that we don't want to have an impact on the world, but actually that our impact on the world is through investing in the Jewish community specifically, right? And then this idea of the synthesized approach, where you're saying, okay, like Judaism is both a particularist people with a universalist mission. And we don't just give some to here and some to here, but we specifically give to universalist causes that speak to our Jewish mission. When I give to universalist causes, I'm doing it because of my Jewish particular identity, and not just as a way to balance these two identities. I think it's a really powerful way of thinking about it. Listening to her lecture made me want to learn more about Zev Jabotinsky, right? Because I remember Zev Jabotinsky as the classic example of revisionist Zionism. It's his approach that leads to sort of some of the most fascistic aspects of Jewish, right? The Lehi and the Stern Gang, right? Are right Jabotinskyist ideas. Jabotinsky famously wrote, "There are two sides to the Jordan River, and both sides are Israel classically, right? The Jordan River is the backbone," Jabotinsky wrote, of the classical country of Israel in the time of the Davidic and Solomonic kingdoms, and also in the time of the second temple period, right? And like, indeed, Jews did live on both sides of the Jordan River. The Torah describes that there were several tribes that settled on that side. And I remember learning that little song, right? There are two sides to the river of Jordan. This one is ours, and that is well, right? Like, you know, classic Jabotinsky revisionist Zionism, right? To think about Jabotinsky as also, really speaking to the importance of democracy and liberalism, and protecting and treating with kindness the Arab citizens of the state. Just very, very cool. Sort of how Menachem Begin, who was the student of Zev Jabotinsky, is probably the most interesting and complex of Israel's prime ministers. All right, so we have two choices. We can spend some time listening to the discussion with Yossi Klein Halevi and Alana Steinhain. It's worthwhile, but you all have access to this on the website, so you could just do that on your own time. I think it being 9:15, it might be just better for us to continue talking for another few minutes and wrapping things up, and we'll, you can watch the rest of the discussion part between this week and next week. So what do you think? I saw some people like nodding when I suggested the second one, so we're going to go with that. But if you feel particularly sad that we didn't get to the interview, do send me an email to let me know, and I'll try really hard to make sure that doesn't happen again. There was just a lot to discuss, and I wanted to spend the time on the text that I thought it would take. Great. So for any other comments before we wrap up? Yeah, Steve.
I got distracted by reading phone calls a couple of times, so it might be that I missed something, but I was waiting for somebody to talk about the covenant with Noah as a source of universal obligation and the covenant with Moses as a source of particular obligation. Because I've always seen the whole point of the Noah story as being that this is where the universal obligations come from. And then there's this other place where the particularist obligation come from, but because they're both covenants with God, they must have some degree of underlying compatibility, which I guess is in the synthesis camp, maybe. But did anybody, is that an approach that anybody is taking or should be taking, or is that a valid source of trying to understand universal origins without having to find them at Sinai?
I was thinking about it specifically with Noah, because the Noahide laws came before Sinai and are a universalist construct.
Right.
And then we got more particular, as it were.
Yeah.
And it makes it easy to leave Bereshit in the universalist camp, because that is post Noah, but before Sinai.
Right. Yeah. So I think that certainly Genesis, like the first 11 chapters of Genesis, including the story of Noah and the Noahide laws, is the sort of universalist approach. And then from Abraham onward is the particular story of the Jewish people. And Abraham is really seen as the first Jew. And so I do think that that's right. I mean, I think that the particular covenant that God makes with Abraham, sort of like, okay, God tries creating the world and sort of being in relationship with everybody, and that doesn't work as well as God hopes, and it leads to violence and destruction and lawlessness. And so God starts over, and God says, okay, Noah, just 7 laws for you and your descendants, just 7 laws. But then 10 generations later, God says, okay, I would really like to spread my sovereignty, my universal message, my mission to the whole world, but I'm going to do it through the means of this particular family. All right. Abraham and Abraham's descendants are going to be my messengers for a universalist vision for the world. And I'm going to be able to influence everyone through Abraham. And I do think that that's the sense that Genesis is making. And then certainly Sinai represents sort of the national fruition of that covenant that God made with Abraham to create a Jewish people that is living with an aspiration of living as a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, living in a way that lives up to this standard of God's law. So I agree with you, Stephen. I think that's right. Any other reactions, thoughts?
I guess the synthesis or the idea that each of the sides, the particularism and universalism, need each other appeals to me in some way, and I'd like to see that fleshed out more in terms of how that works. And
Yeah,
I have my own kind of ideas about it, but I sort of, I get a sense that it's necessary. I get more into esoteric areas, that the kind of the fractal universe where each little part has the whole thing in it, and so on and so forth. But practically speaking, how does one do that without just screaming at each other and hating each other?
Yeah, so I sort of feel like
of thing.
The synthesis approach is the approach that I was trying to show in these texts is inherent in the way that that Genesis talks about Abraham. That is, Abraham has a particularist mission with universal aims.
Right.
And I feel like that is a synthesis approach. That is, just as you might think, okay, Abraham got this particular relationship with God that's supposed to create blessing and justice and lawful, right? Tzedek u'mishpat, righteousness and justice for everybody in the world, right? It's supposed to be a blessing and a light unto the nations, a blessing for all peoples, right? Just like that. So you might say about modern state of Israel, you might describe it this way, right? The state of Israel is the nationalist expression of the Jewish people, and it must aspire to universal moral aims. Without, right, so I think without being so universalistic that it stops being a Jewish state, right? Without being so universalistic that it gives up its own right to exist. Without being so universalistic that it has to commit self-sacrifice to be able to do it, right? That's not necessary. That's not necessary to hold the balance, to hold this synthesis. You have to, right? But if you're not evaluating yourself on the basis of those moral aims, then you're failing. And so we would have to say, right? Israel must do its best to confront the ways in which it fails to live up to its own aspirations of universal morality. Yeah. Today, I had the opportunity through APAC to hear Yossi Klein Levy discuss the current situation with the Amnesty report, and and I'm going to share more about it on Shabbat, but I really felt like Yossi Klein Halevi is trying very hard to present kind of a synthesis approach to this. In the what you'll see in the what you'll see in the interview when you watch it is that he comes off as, in that moment of this particular interview, as being like very concerned about Israel's safety, right? Israel has to be secure first. And I think he still believes that, right? I think he's very strong on it. Israel has to be secure first. Only once Israel is secure can you worry about the other aspects, right? Israel's safety is first, right? Our children first. But I think once you've gotten a sense of security, then you have to say, okay, now how can we support everybody's right to a dignified life without, you know, while maintaining the security, you know, we have to make sure that everybody's dignity is supported. I think that's really important. All right. Well, we're going to call it a night. We will meet again next Thursday. This fourth session was the end of our four sort of beginning, like sort of the conceptual approaches to these different stories that we tell about Jewish peoplehood. And we're now going to sort of start looking at some of the challenges to telling this story, right? They call it contemporary challenges to Jewish peoplehood. And the first challenge is this issue of nationalism, ultranationalism, and fascism, which we're going to look at next week. And the danger, of course, of particularism is that particularism can lead to ultranationalism. And ultranationalism,
Those things.
right? Fascism, not particularly good. And that's why we say, oh, this has fascistic tendencies and we want to stay away from that, right? So, okay. I do think that the conversation that we didn't watch, where Alana Steinhain moderates, that conversation does sort of bridge between this idea of universalism and particularism and this going into this issue of nationalism, because one of the things that they talk about is the difference in some ways between particularism and nationalism. So I do recommend that if you have a chance to watch that, and I will watch it again and see how it interfaces with the next lecture and see if it makes sense to spend time on it. But my hunch will be that we'll just go straight to next class without going back. All right, Erev Tov, everyone.
So how do I find that? Do I go on the Hartman site? How do I?
Yeah, if you go on the Hartman site, you've logged on to the Hartman site, then you have access to all of the materials for this course, including the course pack. And yeah, Miriam, if you're having a hard time finding it, send me an email and I will send you instructions. Steve Schmidt just put the link in the chat.
Hartman.org. Okay. Is IL? Okay.
Okay.
All right. Thank you.
Terrific.
Okay.